Welcome back to the Emma podcast. I'm Anna, and today I'm joined by Eric.
Each episode, we take a deep dive into the regulatory, quality, and operational shifts shaping the future of life sciences and healthcare innovation. And today we're focusing on a region that's rapidly becoming central to global medtech strategy, the Gulf Cooperation Council.
Specifically, we're talking about medtech growth in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, and what device innovators need to understand about regulatory pathways as they bring new technologies into these markets.
This is a conversation we're having more and more with medtech companies of all sizes. Some are entering the region for the first time. Others are expanding their footprint beyond distribution and thinking about long-term presence, local partnerships, and even regional manufacturing.
What's driving that interest is not just market size, but momentum. Healthcare systems across the GCC are evolving quickly, and governments are making deliberate investments in advanced medical technology, digital health, and innovation driven care.
For a long time, many medtech companies viewed the GCC primarily as a downstream commercial market. Devices were developed and approved elsewhere, then introduced into the region later in the product lifecycle.
What's changing now is that countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia are positioning themselves as active participants in healthcare innovation, not just end users of it.
That shift is being driven by national healthcare strategies focused on improving patient outcomes, expanding access to advanced technologies, and building local capabilities. MedTech plays a central role in those plans.
At the same time, global medtech companies are facing increasing pressure in traditional markets. Regulatory timelines are lengthening, competition is intense, and innovation cycles are accelerating. Expanding into new regions is no longer just about growth, it's about resilience.
That's where the GCC stands out, not because regulatory standards are lower, but because regulatory frameworks are becoming more defined, more transparent, and increasingly aligned with international best practices.
An important thing to understand from the start is that the GCC is not a single regulatory environment.
The UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar each have their own regulatory authorities, approval processes, and expectations. In the UAE, regulatory systems have evolved rapidly over the past several years, with a strong emphasis on alignment to international standards and efficient access to innovative devices. The country has positioned itself as a regional hub for healthcare and medtech activity.
Saudi Arabia represents a different kind of opportunity. With its large population and ambitious healthcare transformation agenda, KSA has become a priority market for many device manufacturers. Regulatory oversight has strengthened significantly, and expectations around quality systems, clinical evidence, and post market controls are continuing to rise.
Qatar, while smaller in population, has invested heavily in advanced healthcare infrastructure and research capabilities. For certain device categories, it offers a highly sophisticated clinical environment and strong alignment with global regulatory principles.
What all three countries share is a clear intent to balance innovation with patient safety. Regulators are focused on enabling access to advanced medical devices, but they expect manufacturers to demonstrate robust quality, performance, and lifecycle management.
For device innovators, this means regulatory strategy needs to be proactive. Simply repurposing submissions prepared for other regions without considering local expectations often leads to delays and rework.
Another important shift across the region is the growing emphasis on risk based regulation. Device classification, intended use, and risk profile play a critical role in determining documentation requirements and review timelines.
Understanding how a device is classified locally and how those classifications may differ across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar is essential for building an efficient entry strategy.
There's also increasing focus on post market responsibilities. Regulators want confidence that manufacturers will remain engaged after approval with systems in place for vigilance, complaints handling, and change management.
This is particularly relevant as more devices incorporate software, connectivity, and data-driven functionality. Digital and software-based devices are becoming more common, and regulators are actively refining expectations around validation, cybersecurity, and lifecycle control.
What we're seeing is that medtech companies that succeed in the GCC are those that invest early in understanding regulatory pathways, build strong local partnerships, and treat the region as a strategic pillar rather than an afterthought.
In this episode, we're going to unpack how regulatory pathways work across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, what device innovators need to prepare, and where companies most often encounter challenges if they're not ready.
Because while the opportunity is significant, success in the GCC requires clarity, planning, and a regulatory strategy designed specifically for the region.
Once companies move from interest to execution, the differences between global assumptions and regional realities become much more apparent. Many medtech organizations expect that approvals in the US or EU will translate smoothly into GCC markets, but local regulatory expectations still shape how those approvals are reviewed and accepted.
In the UAE, reliance pathways and reference market approvals can support faster access, but they don't remove the need for complete, well structured documentation. Regulators still expect manufacturers to clearly demonstrate safety, performance, and quality system compliance, and to present that information in a way that aligns with local review processes.
Local representation also plays a significant role. Having an authorized representative or distributor who understands regulatory requirements, submission logistics, and post approval responsibilities can meaningfully affect timelines and communication with authorities.
Saudi Arabia presents a more rigorous regulatory environment, particularly as oversight continues to strengthen. Expectations around technical documentation, risk management, and quality system maturity are high, especially for higher risk devices.
Clinical evidence is an area where companies often underestimate requirements. Depending on device classification and intended use, regulators may expect data that demonstrates performance in relevant clinical settings. Understanding when international data is sufficient and when additional justification is needed is critical.
Post market surveillance is another area of increased focus in Saudi Arabia. Vigilance reporting, complaint handling, and field safety corrective actions are not viewed as downstream activities. They're central to maintaining market authorization.
Qatar's regulatory framework reflects its emphasis on high quality healthcare delivery. While the market is smaller, expectations around traceability, lifecycle management, and documentation are strong, particularly for innovative or complex devices.
Across all three countries, one trend is consistent. Regulators are increasingly open to early engagement. Pre submission discussions and clarification meetings allow manufacturers to align expectations before formal review begins.
This is especially valuable for software based and digitally enabled devices. AI driven tools, connected platforms, and data intensive technologies don't always fit neatly into traditional device categories. Early dialogue helps clarify classification, validation scope, and cybersecurity expectations.
Change management is another area where organizations often run into difficulty. Once a device is approved, changes to design, manufacturing, software, labeling, or intended use still require regulatory consideration.
GCC authorities are paying closer attention to lifecycle control. Manufacturers need clear internal processes to assess the regulatory impact of changes and determine notification or approval requirements on a country by country basis.
Labeling and language requirements also matter more than companies often expect. While English is commonly accepted, certain markets may require Arabic labeling or specific local information. These details can affect approval timelines if not addressed early.
Inspection readiness is becoming increasingly important as regulatory frameworks mature. Companies should assume that inspections, whether remote or on site, are part of doing business in the region.
Being inspection ready means being able to clearly explain how quality systems are implemented, how suppliers are controlled, and how risks are managed across the device lifecycle. Documentation alone isn't enough. Understanding and ownership matter.
As medtech companies scale their presence in the GCC, coordination becomes more complex. Managing approvals, renewals, vigilance, and changes across multiple countries requires clear governance and defined responsibilities.
Some organizations centralize regional regulatory strategy, while others maintain country specific models. Either approach can work, but only if roles, decision authority, and escalation pathways are clearly defined.
What becomes clear over time is that the GCC is no longer a region that can be managed lightly. Regulatory expectations are evolving quickly, and successful companies are those that treat the region with the same rigor as any major global market.
For organizations willing to invest in preparation, local insight, and proactive engagement, regulatory pathways in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar can support not just market access, but sustainable growth and long term credibility.
And as medtech innovation continues to accelerate, that foundation becomes increasingly important for navigating both opportunity and risk in a rapidly evolving healthcare landscape.
As companies gain more experience operating in the GCC, another layer of complexity begins to surface around internal readiness. Regulatory approval is only one part of the equation. Sustaining compliance over time requires organizations to adapt how they operate globally.
One of the first areas this shows up is in quality system alignment. Many medtech companies have robust global QMS frameworks, but those systems are often designed around US or EU expectations. Translating them effectively to the GCC requires attention to regional nuances.
Authorities want to see that quality systems are not just compliant on paper, but actively implemented and understood. That includes how complaints are handled, how vigilance is reported, and how corrective and preventive actions are managed in real time.
For companies using distributors or local service providers, this becomes even more important. While certain activities may be outsourced, accountability remains with the manufacturer. Regulators expect clear oversight, training, and control of third-party partners.
This often requires strengthening agreements, clarifying roles, and implementing regular performance monitoring. Companies that treat distributors as purely commercial partners tend to encounter issues when regulatory questions arise.
Another important consideration is how regulatory intelligence is managed. Requirements across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are evolving quickly. Guidance documents, submission portals, and procedural expectations can change with limited notice.
Organizations that rely on static assumptions or outdated playbooks are more likely to face delays. Those that invest in continuous monitoring and local expertise are better positioned to adapt as expectations shift.
There's also increasing attention on traceability and documentation structure. Regulators want to see clear connections between design inputs, risk controls, verification activities, and clinical evidence. When documentation is fragmented, review becomes slower and more challenging.
This has driven many companies to rethink how they organize technical documentation. Instead of simply compiling documents, they focus on telling a coherent regulatory story that aligns design, risk, and performance.
Software-based devices introduce additional expectations. Validation of software lifecycle processes, cybersecurity risk management, and update controls are receiving more scrutiny across the region.
Authorities are asking more detailed questions about how software updates are assessed, how users are notified, and how performance is monitored post-deployment. These considerations are becoming central to regulatory confidence.
Another emerging theme is real-world performance data. As healthcare systems across the GCC become more digitized, regulators are increasingly interested in how manufacturers monitor device performance once products are in use.
This creates both opportunity and responsibility. Companies that can demonstrate proactive monitoring and data driven improvement strengthen trust. Those that lack visibility into post market performance may face increased scrutiny.
There's also a strategic dimension to all of this. Regulatory readiness in the GCC increasingly supports broader organizational goals. Companies with strong regional compliance foundations are better positioned to support clinical research, pilot programs, and innovation partnerships.
Governments across the region are encouraging collaboration, localization, and technology transfer. Regulatory credibility often becomes a prerequisite for participating in these initiatives.
As expectations continue to rise, internal alignment becomes critical. Regulatory, quality, R&D, and commercial teams need to operate from a shared understanding of regional priorities and constraints.
Misalignment internally often manifests as inconsistent messaging to regulators, delayed responses, or incomplete submissions. Clear governance and communication reduce these risks.
Another lesson emerging from the region is the value of phased expansion. Companies that enter one market thoughtfully and apply lessons learned to others tend to build stronger foundations than those that expand too quickly.
This doesn't mean moving slowly, it means moving deliberately, understanding what works, what doesn't, and where adaptation is needed before scaling across the region.
Over time, organizations that take this approach develop confidence, not just in navigating GCC pathways, but in managing regulatory complexity more broadly. That capability becomes increasingly valuable as global expectations converge around lifecycle oversight and risk-based regulation.
In that sense, experience in the GCC often strengthens global regulatory maturity. Companies become better at engaging with authorities, managing change, and sustaining compliance across diverse markets.
And as medtech innovation continues to accelerate, that maturity becomes a competitive advantage. Not just for accessing markets, but for building trust with regulators, healthcare systems, and patients alike.
That trust, ultimately, is what enables sustainable growth in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and beyond.
As regulatory expectations continue to evolve across the GCC, another important shift begins to emerge around long-term life cycle management. Approval is no longer viewed as the finish line. It's the starting point of an ongoing regulatory relationship.
Authorities in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are increasingly focused on how devices are managed once they're on the market. That includes how performance is monitored, how safety signals are detected, and how manufacturers respond when issues arise.
This places greater emphasis on vigilance systems and post-market surveillance processes. Manufacturers need to demonstrate not only that these systems exist, but that they're actively used, reviewed, and integrated into decision-making.
For many organizations, this requires moving beyond a reactive approach. Instead of waiting for complaints or adverse events to accumulate, regulators expect proactive monitoring and trend analysis.
This is especially relevant for devices with software components or connectivity features. Performance may change over time due to updates, environmental factors, or user behavior. Manufacturers need visibility into those changes and clear processes for assessing risk.
Change control becomes central here. Updates to software, modifications to hardware components, or changes in manufacturing processes all need to be evaluated through a regulatory lens.
Authorities want to understand how changes are assessed, documented, and communicated. They expect manufacturers to determine whether changes require notification, approval, or updated documentation on a country-specific basis.
This is an area where global change processes often fall short. A change that's acceptable in one market may require additional review in another. Companies operating in the GCC need mechanisms to capture those differences and act accordingly.
Another emerging expectation is transparency. Regulators want open communication when issues arise. Early notification, clear root cause analysis, and timely corrective actions go a long way in maintaining trust.
Organizations that attempt to minimize or delay disclosure often face greater scrutiny later. In contrast, those that engage proactively tend to build stronger regulatory relationships over time.
There's also growing attention on field actions and recalls. While these events are relatively rare, authorities expect manufacturers to be prepared. That includes having documented procedures, trained teams, and clear communication pathways.
Preparedness isn't just about having a plan on paper, it's about having practiced processes and defined responsibilities so actions can be taken quickly if needed.
Another factor influencing long-term compliance is organizational continuity. Staff turnover, changes in distributors, or restructuring can disrupt regulatory oversight if not managed carefully.
Regulators expect continuity and accountability. Changes in representation or responsibility must be communicated, and knowledge transfer must be managed to avoid gaps.
This reinforces the importance of institutional knowledge. Companies that document regulatory decisions, maintain clear records, and retain historical context are better equipped to respond to questions years after initial approval.
Over time, these practices contribute to regulatory credibility. Authorities gain confidence that the manufacturer understands its obligations and is committed to ongoing compliance.
That credibility can have practical benefits. Reviews may become more efficient. Communication becomes more straightforward. Expectations are clearer on both sides.
As medtech ecosystems in the GCC continue to mature, regulators are also becoming more connected globally. Information sharing, reliance models, and alignment with international frameworks are expanding.
This means that actions taken in one market may have implications elsewhere. Vigilance reports, recalls, or compliance issues can influence regulatory perception beyond a single country.
For manufacturers, this reinforces the importance of consistency. A strong compliance posture in the GCC supports credibility globally, just as weaknesses can have broader consequences.
Another long-term consideration is how regulatory strategy supports innovation pipelines. Companies developing next-generation devices benefit from lessons learned during earlier approvals.
Understanding how authorities interpret risk, evaluate evidence, and manage post market expectations helps shape future submissions more effectively.
This creates a feedback loop. Experience builds insight. Insight improves strategy. Strategy supports smoother execution.
As that cycle continues, regulatory functions become more integrated into innovation planning rather than operating at the end of development.
That integration is increasingly important as medtech products become more complex, interconnected, and data-driven. Regulatory pathways need to keep pace with innovation, and manufacturers play a role in shaping how that happens.
Ultimately, success in the GCC isn't defined by a single approval or launch. It's defined by the ability to operate compliantly over time, adapt to evolving expectations, and maintain trust with regulators and healthcare systems.
Organizations that approach the region with that long-term mindset are better positioned to navigate complexity, support innovation, and build sustainable presence across the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar.
And as the medtech landscape continues to evolve, that capability becomes one of the most valuable assets a company can develop.
As that long-term mindset takes hold, another important dynamic begins to emerge around how companies position themselves within the regional medtech ecosystem. Regulatory engagement is no longer just transactional. It becomes relational.
Authorities in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are building institutional knowledge about manufacturers over time. They remember how companies engage, how transparent they are, and how effectively they manage issues when they arise.
That history matters. Manufacturers that communicate clearly, respond promptly, and demonstrate accountability tend to establish credibility that carries forward into future submissions and interactions.
This is particularly relevant as regulators in the region continue to refine reliance and recognition pathways. Prior interactions, compliance history, and demonstrated maturity can influence how efficiently reviews proceed.
For medtech innovators, this reinforces the value of consistency. Inconsistent messaging, fragmented documentation, or delayed responses can undermine trust, even when the underlying product is strong.
Another area where relationships matter is in the interpretation of evolving requirements. As guidance develops, especially for novel technologies, there may be gray areas. Open dialogue helps resolve ambiguity before it becomes a problem.
This is especially true for devices incorporating artificial intelligence, machine learning, or adaptive software. These technologies challenge traditional regulatory concepts like fixed specifications and static validation.
Authorities are actively grappling with how to regulate these innovations responsibly. Manufacturers that engage thoughtfully and contribute to that conversation are often better positioned to navigate uncertainty.
That engagement requires internal alignment. Regulatory, quality, engineering, and clinical teams need to share a common understanding of how products function and how risks are managed.
When internal teams aren't aligned, it becomes difficult to explain complex technologies to regulators in a clear and consistent way. That confusion can delay approvals or raise unnecessary concerns.
This alignment also influences how companies approach evidence generation. Beyond traditional clinical data, regulators are increasingly interested in performance monitoring, usability data, and real world outcomes.
For some device categories, especially digital and connected technologies, post market data becomes a critical part of the regulatory story. Companies need systems capable of collecting, analyzing, and acting on that data.
That capability doesn't happen by accident. It requires planning, infrastructure, and governance. Companies that invest early in these systems are better positioned to meet rising expectations.
There's also a growing emphasis on localization. Governments across the GCC are encouraging local manufacturing, service capability, and technical expertise as part of broader economic strategies.
For medtech companies, this creates both opportunity and responsibility. Localization initiatives can support faster access, stronger partnerships, and long term presence, but they also require deeper regulatory engagement.
Local manufacturing or assembly introduces additional oversight requirements. Quality systems, supplier controls, and inspection readiness become even more important.
Similarly, local servicing or software support requires clear documentation, training, and accountability. Regulators want assurance that devices will be maintained safely and effectively throughout their life cycle.
Another factor shaping the regulatory environment is speed of innovation. As device development cycles shorten, regulatory processes must adapt without compromising rigor.
Manufacturers that design regulatory strategy alongside product development are better equipped to manage this pace. Those that treat regulatory as an afterthought often struggle to keep up.
This is where cross functional integration becomes a differentiator. When regulatory considerations are embedded early, design decisions are more likely to align with approval and post market expectations.
That integration also reduces the likelihood of late stage redesigns or data gaps that can delay entry into the GCC.
Over time, organizations that operate this way develop a more predictable and scalable approach to regional expansion. They understand how to plan submissions, manage changes, and respond to evolving requirements.
This predictability supports broader business confidence. Leadership can make investment decisions knowing that regulatory pathways are understood and manageable.
As medtech innovation continues to accelerate globally, regions like the GCC are becoming increasingly important test beds for how modern regulatory systems balance innovation and safety.
Manufacturers that engage deeply, build trust, and invest in long term capability often find that the region supports not just access, but growth, collaboration, and influence.
And as regulatory frameworks continue to mature, the role of manufacturers in shaping responsible innovation becomes more pronounced.
Success in this context is no longer defined by simply entering the market. It's defined by the ability to operate responsibly, adapt continuously, and contribute meaningfully to a healthcare ecosystem that is evolving rapidly.
That's the reality medtech innovators are navigating today in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. And it's a reality that rewards preparation, partnership, and sustained commitment.
As this landscape continues to evolve, what becomes increasingly clear is that medtech growth in the GCC is not being driven by shortcuts or relaxed standards. It's being driven by intentional regulatory development and a clear expectation that innovation and accountability move together.
For device innovators, this creates a different kind of opportunity. Success in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar isn't about finding the fastest path around regulation. It's about understanding how regulatory pathways are structured and using them to support safe, effective, and scalable innovation.
The companies that thrive in this environment are the ones that treat regulatory strategy as a core capability. They invest early in understanding local expectations. They align global quality systems with regional execution, and they engage regulators as long-term partners rather than transactional reviewers.
This approach also supports resilience. As regulatory frameworks continue to mature and expectations rise, organizations with strong foundations are better positioned to adapt. They can respond to changes, manage lifecycle requirements, and support next generation devices with confidence.
Another defining factor is consistency. Regulators value predictability, transparency, and follow-through. Companies that demonstrate these traits build trust over time, and that trust often translates into more efficient communication and smoother regulatory interactions.
As medtech technologies continue to evolve, especially in areas like software, connectivity, and data driven devices, that trust becomes even more important. Regulators want assurance that innovation is matched with control, governance, and long term accountability.
What we're seeing across the GCC is a clear message. The region is open to innovation, but it expects manufacturers to show up prepared. Prepared with strong documentation, robust quality systems, and a clear understanding of life cycle responsibilities.
For organizations willing to make that investment, the GCC offers more than market access. It offers a chance to participate in shaping how modern regulatory systems support innovation responsibly.
And as healthcare systems across the region continue to advance, medtech companies that align regulatory strategy with long-term vision will be the ones best positioned to grow, adapt, and lead.
That's ultimately what medtech growth in the GCC is about. Not just entering new markets, but building sustainable, compliant pathways that support innovation today and into the future.
Thank you for joining us for today's deep dive. If your organization needs support preparing for remote inspections, enhancing your risk-based regulatory strategy, or modernizing your quality systems, Emma International is here to help. You can reach us anytime at info@emmainternational.com or visit us at emmainternational.com.
Make sure to subscribe on YouTube and Spotify so you never miss an episode. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay innovative.